This is going to be the weirdest pseudo-rumination I've ever done, hence the title. The thing is, the more I thought about how to construct this, the more I thought about how to present it, and the otherwise format, execution, etc., the more I realized I couldn't actually ruminate it in the traditional sense of the word. All I could do, well, I don't want to get too much ahead of myself, but all I could do was talk about the books, not the story, if you understand the significance of that. So, in advance, I just want to say I apologize, because this is probably going to be pretty short, and not really the same thing as what I usually do. Especially to you, Shadow, because I know that you're one of the people who requested this. The reason why this is different is because these are books. Now, let's talk about that for a moment. When you are watching anything, movie, television, or game, with few exceptions, for the most part, what you can do is extrapolate and examine and think upon things that are happening because we don't know the character's thoughts. All we have is the performance, the dialogue, the audio cues, the musical cues, which are in addition to that, the way the shot is directed, the way the shot is shown, the way editing, the way, there's tons of both audio and visual elements in addition to the writing, the acting, and the directing that tell us what there's trying to be displayed here. Now, that is, of course, something that is interpretive, but it's different from any kind of written material, because one of the biggest things about most written materials, especially in the Star Wars category, and especially in these things, is we know the thoughts of the characters. There are very few characters we do not actually jump to a first-person perspective on, one of them being Thrawn himself. And so we know the thoughts of these characters. We know what they're thinking. We know why they're thinking it. So we don't really have to extrapolate because we're told, right? And yet, we are missing everything else. This is a fascinating thing, and I've actually been practicing in my head how I want to explain this over the last few hours here, and indeed last few days, because it's a weird phenomenon that basically a book is a unique medium because a book could be best described as entirely interpretive. Yes, we'd have the thoughts of the characters, but everything else about everything else that is being presented is, by design, fully up to you, the reader, to determine your perspective of that, your opinion on that, what you see, what you think, etc. You don't have audio cues, you don't have visual cues, you don't have appearances, you don't have the way their voice sounds, you don't have tonality. All of that is up to you to show it. And I've seen this a dozen times on how, sorry, I'm still really sick, on how, there's a specific character from the same book, completely ignoring contiguous works, and that same character, other people I've talked to have had completely different interpretations of that character because it was a written medium. Because that is one of the powers of books, of written medium, is it speaks to us directly, individually, because most of the time we don't even think about doing that sort of interpretive thing. It's not like I go and like I go and read a book and say, well, I think of this character, and clearly he's a this kind of character. It forms naturally in my mind, the way they're presented, and this is the important part, the way I think of them, the way I want to think of them. Sometimes that can actually get into interpretiveness to the point where you're basically rewriting aspects of the character to make it better suit what you have perceived or want to perceive. I myself have done this. Many other people have as well. Don't give me that look. You've probably done it too. It's actually funny because this is a major theme in the Hand of Thrawn duology by Timothy Zahn, who also, if those of you don't know, did the Thrawn Trilogy, which is the books I'm discussing here. The theme here being that everyone's interpretation of Thrawn was this legend, this amazing, incredible man who, the real man, if you go back and read the Thrawn Trilogy, did not and could not live up to that legend. And yet, One of the interesting things is the fact that Thrawn was actually still 2 steps ahead of everyone, although that plot thread was then abandoned, and the extended continuity was basically told to go screw itself by Disney, so we'll probably never see the actual Return of Thrawn, but I digress. But this interpretive nature is one of the things that I find to be a genuine positive. This is not complaint. I feel that the fact that we can all look at these things and our brains, the way we think and the way we feel, naturally inclines itself toward warping, or not even warping, that sounds like it's a bad thing, but like just altering the perception of what we're seeing in the characters and in the settings of the world. I had such a distinct mental image of Coruscant, which I called Coruscant back when this came out, actually, and of Palayan, and of, that underwater mining thing that Londo set up, all this stuff that then when they actually came up with the comic book series, I look at that and I was like, oh wow, that's not what I thought of at all, because it was how I was interpreting it, I mention this because due to that nature, that is the main reason I cannot truly ruminate in my standard style on any books. Because a book by its very nature is interpretive, and all you're going to hear is my interpretation. Now I know you're going to pull it technically on me and say, well, that's all you ever hear is my interpretation, and that is true, but there's a difference between I would like a 7-course meal and I would like it be set in this specific area or whatever, and I would like, okay, that's a bad analogy, I really am tired, I'm sorry. The analogy, okay, the point I'm trying to make here is that in all circumstances what you're hearing is my opinion, my extrapolation, my rumination. There's a reason I use that word, ruminate. It's because I thought and analyzed and dissected and disseminated and tried to deconstruct. But when it comes to a book, much more of that is me, coming from me directly rather than coming from the book, okay? Because, again, that's the nature of a book. Or at least most books, I should say. And there are exceptions in both the audiovisual medium and in the written medium of both this and not this, respectively. So I'm not really going to be doing that. I actually thought about doing just like a character analysis, going down the list, so to speak, but I actually kind of threw that out the window. I do want to use a specific example of what I'm talking about, though. And this is also one of the reasons why the extended universe of Star Wars is awesome. I'm sorry. I know I've said that before. I've even had people disagree with me, and that's fine. Disagreements are natural. I'm totally with that. But I've yet to hear any shrieking mimsies tell me about how stupid I am for liking the extended continuity. But my opinion is that the EU was definitely a net positive. And one of the reasons why can be best described as Lando Calrissian. Allow me to explain. We see Lando relatively briefly in the movies. This actually came to mind as I was rewatching Empire and Return, because he does have a degree of character, and Lord knows that the actor is more than capable enough of, Billy D. Williams, more than capable enough of pulling off some subtlety in his performance, and the directors of both pieces were good character workers, so they could do something with that. But when you really think about it, Lando doesn't have much characterization to him. So when Timothy Zahn sat down to write this trilogy, he put his interpretation down on the pages. Now, the interesting thing about this is Star Wars is semi-unique in the fact that, they have an extended universe. They have an extended universe that is actually contiguous with the main movies. I don't care what Disney says. They bothered to maintain that continuity for decades. Granted, okay, decades is maybe overselling it, but the point is it has been a while. So, Lando, as he was written, that's now canon, that Lando. But then the interesting thing is, other people, readers and writers alike, will read that and interpret his interpretation, which leads to other writers to continue to write Lando into stories. He had a really good piece in the Black Fleet Crisis, and I believe, I can't remember the other one, but then he came full circle in Hand of Thrawn Duology. I'll be talking about that in a minute. But the point is, it's literally, I don't know how to explain this. When children, this is a weird analogy, when children are growing up, the way that they grow is through societal interaction. This is one of the reasons I've often said that recess is the most important aspect of school, and I mean this sincerely. Because recess is where you learn how to interact with other people, who then learn how to interact with other people because they interacted with you, which changes your interactions because they are now interacting based on your interactions, and you can see how it bounces back and forth amongst all these people. And what forms, if you were to picture this as like a chunk of clay, and then it goes over here, and then it's shaped a little bit because of that interaction, and then this interaction, and it gets, just as it bounces back and forth between these people, it shapes more and more until you actually have a sculpture there. That is how people, human beings, grow, is through societal. It's one of the reasons as much as I like the idea of homeschooling, I would always, if I ever did that, I would fully intend to ensure that my child, or whoever it was I was homeschooling, had interaction with other people, because that is so necessary to humanity, to existence, to the very concepts of society, culture, etc. But it's the same thing when it comes to a fictional work like this one. Now, this is true in general, even when things are not canon, but it is especially true when it has been officially stated, yes, this is canon, because it also affects future writers. Those now future writers have seen interpretations of an interpretation of an interpretation of a character. And so we see the character that became Palpatine is actually a better example than Lando, really. The incredible genius and the ridiculously powerful machination, the chess master that Palpatine is, that we think of him now, happened because he was written based on an interpretation of the movies, which was then interpreted and interpreted and interpreted, and it just kind of bounced out until this image of what I think of at least, now of Palpatine formed out of that. And it's the same thing with Lando. Like, for example, if I was to talk about Lando, I would say his single most defining trait, I can't bullet point it, but to summarize in a sentence, is the fact that he never at any moment loses his optimism and idealism and enthusiasm for what he does. This is a man who is a genuinely good man, who is brilliant at doing things that are basically crazy and pulling off ridiculous stunts in order to try and make a profit out of it, and somehow being a good enough administrator and leader and enough of a charismatic person to rope together the funding to make it happen, and then make it continue working and actually make profit off of it. And that's what he loves doing, right? But the real defining trait there for me, for Lando, my interpretation, is the fact that he keeps getting knocked across the knees. He keeps losing everything, usually because the Empire shows up for some reason or another. And every time he loses anything, picks himself up, dusts himself off, and he is literally already on the next thing, working on the next step. Just bam, just like that. Because that's Lando, as I interpret him, because of their interpretations of interpretation. You see where this goes. This is one of the powers of writing in general, and the written medium in general, especially when it bounces around like this. Other things have toyed with this idea. Doctor Who, Star Trek. I know I'm leaving science fiction thing, but I'm not doing it on purpose, because both of those have a strong novel continuity pseudo thing. None of them are contiguous in the sense that Star Wars is, and yet a lot of the interpretations that certain writers, the Destiny series comes to mind, do of certain characters came from that same effect, bouncing off of what other writers had already written, based off of their interpretation of other writers, based on interpretations of the original source material of the show. All of this leads me to a fascinating concept, the idea that we see what we choose to, is the way I want to phrase that. Not what we want to, but what our brains naturally develop based on how we are perceiving this information, and what our mood is when we perceive it, and what's going on in our lives when we perceive it, and how our opinions on things are when we perceive it, and all those horribly, wonderfully fascinating things that make up a perspective. Or to put it in another way, you could look at a tree, right? Just look at a tree, okay? And you look at it and say, well, that's a tree. But that's not how real life actually works. You never look at a tree. You look at a tree and there's filters. Probably dozens of filters over your vision, tinting your view. Like I said, use your mood at the specific time. There's possibility of chemical imbalance that can be caused by a dozen of things, not even just actual disability, but simple illness, or some kind of, if you're going through a pregnancy, or if you just had a recent injury or whatever, all these things can taint or taint. I shouldn't say taint, because that's not the wrong word. Can affect your perspective, so that's a filter. You've got the filter of your opinion and belief on things at that point in time. So you see someone who does something you disagree with, that may affect your perspective of that person, this kind of thing, and so forth and so on. So I see Lando Calrissian through my dozens of filters, and that's how I perceive him. This is so true, and this is probably the single strongest example of this is actually comic books. because comic books do the same thing to the nth degree. It is not uncommon for multiple writers to be writing a single story arc, and the way the characters bounce around because the different writers write them in different ways, and never mind the fact that the illustrators write and ink them in different ways, or ink and color them in different ways. All of that affects what actually comes to be of that, why it happens, what we perceive of it, and how they perceive of it, and blah 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 blah. For an particularly egregious example of this, see the Civil War storyline. There was some good stuff there, but a lot of writers who have political opinions took that moment to go ahead and soapbox, because that was their opinion, and therefore they perceived this character would be in favor of or against, as the case may be, their particular views. Now I'm getting way off topic here, so I'm going to bring this back, because the point I'm making with all of this is why I cannot truly ruminate on any books. All I can do is talk about the books themselves. I've been a fan of Timothy Zahn for a while, obviously, I guess. He's a good writer, but it's interesting going back to some of his older works, including this trilogy, because his writing style has definitely evolved since then. I don't know how to properly explain this, but he's a little bit too blunt and poorly constructed in the way he sets up his scenes and his usage of language within his sentences in the Thrawn Trilogy. He obviously has smoothed out and gotten way more experience and been much, much better later on. Do not mistake this for complaint. The Thrawn Trilogy is still great. I just think his later works show how much he's grown as a writer. And again, I point to the Hand of Thrawn duology as a nice way to show how that whole thing came full circle. I also want to give Timothy Zahn huge props. The Extended Universe did not start with Timothy Zahn. Where it started is debatable. And it is, depending on what you define as Extended Universe. Which is funny, because the Extended Universe, despite the continuity thing and the fact that they actually police continuity and stories have to be approved, etc., it's still interpretive even at that point. What is considered Extended Universe, what is not. For example, I mean, is the Ewok Christmas special, is that part of the Extended Universe? You get the point. Most people tend to agree on some basics. And just about everyone I've heard agrees the Thrawn Trilogy deserves to be in that. And I think it cannot be overstated the biggest reason why. Most people nowadays, in a younger demographic, would call this the KOTOR effect. I'll be talking about this in January, hopefully, when I start doing the lore run of the KOTOR series, but forgive me. This is going live in January, isn't it? Whatever. The point being, obviously it's not January yet for me. The point being that what KOTOR did that truly made it a success, in my opinion, was it took all of the elements of Star Wars, but then did it with new settings, new characters, new backdrops, new stories. KOTOR felt like Star Wars, down to the music, down to the aesthetics. Everything about it felt like it was a piece of Star Wars. And so does the Thrawn Trilogy. But in both cases, what they did was they did something with that. They didn't just ape Star Wars. They took that and ran with it. How many new characters, brand new characters, did the Thrawn Trilogy really introduce? I mentioned Lando recently, and this is kind of a weird one. Most people's interpretation of Mon Mothma basically came from this trilogy. Remember, she had one scene in the movies. And I don't even think she was named in that, actually, if I'm not mistaken. She was named in the credits, I believe, but not in the movie. Then again, that was Palpatine. But the point is, after all that, Timothy Zahn looked at her and said, okay, the glue. He said she is the glue that holds the Alliance together. And so he wrote her as she is here. And that kind of effect led to the development of Mon Mothma as a character. Admiral Akbar, who had 2 scenes in the movies. And this is hilarious, because Admiral Akbar is such a major character in the Extended Universe. And yet all of that came from Timothy Zahn and his interpretation of him during his 2 scenes. I know you could argue that his scenes across the Battle of Endor are more than 2. But the point is, he was seen at the Battle of Endor, he was seen at the planning meeting, and that's it. Nothing else. It's our first time seeing him on Cal in general, for that matter. And then he does so much work with the Wookiees. He was our first look at the Wookiees as a culture, as a society, which was all developed based on basically just a few rough draft notes and Chewbacca, and that's it. And so forth and so on. So much of what Star Wars is came from one man's interpretation of another man's interpretation of George Lucas's original idea, which is what we have in the Thrawn Trilogy. But again, I mentioned original characters. General Bel Iblis, which I have no idea how you're supposed to pronounce that, but that's how I've been saying it in my head for years, is an amazing character. Very human, very flawed, very interesting, very... One of my favorite scenes with him is when Mon Mothma comes up and asks him to lead the defense forces, and Leia is trying to convince him to come down, but, and Mon Mothma and him discuss, and it's just such a revelation of the way he has basically been carrying this burden for years. You don't have to say it. He never says, I've been carrying this burden for years. You never jump into Iblis's mind and say, oh, I've been carrying this burden for years. It's just the way he is presented through the words. It's brilliant. Talon Card, in my opinion, one of the best Extended Universe characters. Now, Thrawn wins that argument. I'm sorry, Thrawn is my favorite Extended Universe character, and arguably my second favorite Star Wars character, period. But if we go past Thrawn and Palpatine, he's the number one slot, then we have Talon Card is way up there. Talon Card is an awesome example of exactly what would happen if someone who was brilliant and ingenuitive and charismatic and kind nevertheless found himself on the illegal side of things. In many ways, Talon Card has been described as a literal merger of Lando and Han. The idea of Han's natural charisma and his skill and cunning and his strength and all his experience and knowledge with the underbelly of everything, and Lando's intellect and his administrative abilities and his capacity to lead, just merge those together and we got Talon Card. But I don't make that as a negative, because he does something with that. And this is why Timothy Zahn's a good writer, by the way. I've talked so much, especially in my Voyager videos, about how not to do writing. Read these books. Now, he makes some mistakes. I mentioned this earlier. Timothy Zahn makes some mistakes. He is obviously earlier on in his writing career, but that's how you write something, which I'm going to segue for a moment before I keep talking about characters. You want to know how good of a writer Timothy Zahn is? It takes an excellent type of writer, and I am not this type of writer, by the way, to present a puzzle which the reader already knows the answer to, and the characters then have to figure out and still make that interesting. A lot of writers try this, and I've been talking about Star Trek so much lately because of those ruminations. A lot of writers across Star Trek try to have a puzzle where we, the viewers, already know what's happening, but the characters need to figure it out because they're not us. They don't have the third-person perspective. And it just kind of flops because it's disinteresting. We already know the answer. Presenting that in a way that it's engaging, the way that it's satisfying as the characters piece things together, that's interesting. And then he does something even further with that, and he has several instances of characters putting the pieces together wrong, and them coming to the wrong conclusion, which just leads to that tiny little reaction in the back of your mind, which is something like the lines of, oh, because they got it wrong. They had all the pieces in place, they knew everything that was going on, and they guessed incorrectly, and we know that, because we know the whole picture. It's interesting, isn't it? But anyways, getting back to the original characters thing, and then we have, of course, what some people would consider the single most popular of all of Star Wars Extended Universe character, Mara Jade. Mara Jade, granted, kind of fell off in popularity in more recent years, whatever. But the fact remains, she was also a very interesting and engaging character, especially since she is initially presented as someone who is not. But we do see from her perspective several times, and we do see someone who is interesting specifically because, despite her age and her experience, Mara Jade is someone who never actually had the chance to grow until we see her on camera, so to speak. It was not until her time in Talon Card's organization that we really got to see her flesh out in character, as a person, really grow. She was so much under the heel of the Empire and Palpatine before, and I don't mean that as kind of a negative, as weird as that sounds, because she was a tool, a very powerful, very useful tool that Palpatine actually trusted. Which also, by the way, lends some interesting insight into Palpatine's characters. How many individuals did Palpatine actually trust? Some would argue that list extends to 2 people. One of them is Mara Jade. Think about that for a moment. But anyways, and then of course Thrawn himself. But then, as much as Thrawn is amazing, my mind tends to go to Pelayan. Now, I'm not 100% sure if that's how to pronounce it, but that's how I've heard it many, many times, and I've said it in my head. Captain Palayan is awesome. Because in Palayan we see an Imperial officer, good and bad, but mostly good. We finally get to see, for the first time really, the good side of the Empire. The side of the Empire that is not all about destroying, killing, maiming, abusing, corrupting. We get to see the people who disagreed with Tarkin. We get to see the opposite end of Tarkin. And this will continue throughout the extended universe. And some would argue that the only reason we have a less horrible image of the Empire as a whole is because of Captain Palayan and what was started here in this trilogy. Because some people took the idea of not all the Empire is evil and ran with it. And then we see all the good that was actually done during the Galactic Empire's reign. We see all the things that were positive impacts on the galaxy. We see all the people who were trying their best to actually make it a better place, who joined the military because they wanted to help and protect and defend. Because they're people. They're not freaking Nazis. And to be blunt, even the Nazis were not all horrible. You know, even that is a stereotype. So, okay, let's see. They were not all, I don't know, what's something? They were not all Species 8472. No, I know. I keep going with Star Trek today. Whew, I'm dizzy. My point, though, is Palayan was a wonderful insight into that, and he is such a human character. I think the reason I like Palayan so much is he is basically O'Brien from DS9. If O'Brien just kind of, by circumstance, got promoted and promoted and promoted until he found himself basically in charge of Starfleet as the CNC. Because that's kind of what happens to Palayan. He doesn't really want to rule. He is an officer. Now, he is an officer. Let's make this distinction. He is not a soldier. He is someone who deserves to have his dress blues on, right? But he never wanted that promotion. He was actually, he had basically very, very slowly crawled his way up to first officer rank until the Battle of Endor. Then his captain died, so he became captain. And then thanks to the fact that he was the only one who did anything about it, he basically became de facto fleet captain. Then Thrawn shows up, and he definitely got that fleet captain thing. Then Thrawn died. And he basically kind of got miggled and mixed up until he was basically an admiral. And then Dala handed the reins to him, and he became the supreme freaking commander. It's actually one of my favorite pieces of that novel, by the way, when Dala hands the reins to Palayan, and she salutes him. I liked that. That novel had some serious issues. Darksaber, I believe it was called. But that was not one of them. That was an awesome, awesome scene. But all of that, again, started here. With one man's interpretation of blah, 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 right? And I'm not even getting into the more minor characters. There are a lot of minor characters who are introduced in this to help flesh it out. It's one of those things that goes back to that feel of Star Wars thing. Star Wars always felt like a world to explore because effort was made to... I mentioned this back in A New Hope. Effort was made to casually drop names as if the audience should know what they are without explaining them, which was kind of important in its own weird way. And to have lots of different characters that you interact with, even if you only interact with them a little. If I might digress for a little bit, in Warlords of Draenor... Yeah, I know, I'm talking about WoW, but bear with me, I'm going somewhere with this. In the intro thing, when you're storming the portal, right? There's a small army fighting with you against the Horde, okay? Now, they could have had all of those be like it was back in BC. They're all, like, there's 3 different models of characters, and they all have the same names. They're all just fighting there. They could have done that. What they instead did was give them each individual names and titles, and in some cases guild tags, and each of them had a unique outfit. Something that made sense for their class and for their race, and they had all sorts of different races present. It made it feel more like an actual event was happening because the effort was put on those tiny details. I've talked about this so much lately when it comes to BioWare, because BioWare's approach to gaming has always been in the details. The details help sell things like that. So getting back to the Thrawn Trilogy here, the fact that there's so many minor characters who are named, who are barely fleshed out at all, but they keep being there in the background, and they keep being over here, and they keep being over here. I mean, we got Winters as a result of the Thrawn Trilogy, too, by the way. Oh, God, whoa. All of these different characters help flesh out the world, help make it feel like a world, rather than a story. And Zahn captured that essence brilliantly. I mean, for God's sakes, it is arguable that the Thrawn Trilogy is also where Wedge Antilles really started taking off. Yes, I know, Wedge was in all 3 of the movies, and he's always been a fan favorite. I've talked about why I feel that is. But he actually had a role in the books. Not a big one. but he was competent, and he was on the ball, and he had that... forgive me for saying this for a character on the page, but I interpret him as someone who was charismatic, just like Wedge was in the movies, as the actor who played him was in the movies. And that made more people interested in him. And then we got the Rogue Squadron series, which, by the way, I highly recommend. Good stuff, good stuff. It's basically Wedge Antilles, the book series. It really is awesome. And then they start fleshing out like more things about the setting. Like, again, Coruscant basically came from the Thrawn Trilogy. The idea of a Grand Admiral and everything that meant came from the Thrawn Trilogy. And it's funny because they introduce a concept that they then explain briefly that has already been dealt with, which is another thing, by the way, this leads me to another thing that Zahn did that was brilliant. He fast-forwarded 5 years, I believe it was. It's been 5 years since Return of the Jedi. Brilliant move. Not that there aren't stories to be told immediately after Return of the Jedi. And indeed, there are stories that have been told immediately after Return of the Jedi. Courtship of Princess Leia, Truce of Bakura, the Rogue Squadron series I just mentioned. There have been several. But that 5-year gap, when he was first starting, when none of that stuff existed, enabled him to then say, okay, now what? What has happened over those 5 years? How has the galaxy adapted? How has the galaxy moved on? It also gave him a chance to move on to the point where the Rebel Alliance has become the New Republic. This is a crucial thing, in my opinion. If it was still the ragtag Rebel Alliance, 5 years ago, the Empire wasn't defeated. Kind of disorganized, and a lot of infighting, because Palpatine had basically arranged his power structure so that everything hinged on him, and so when he was removed from it, the Empire just kind of self-destructed. But that still made, the Empire was still a massive force to be dealt with. Flash forward 5 years, and that force is much dwindled, so we actually can show this is what we're doing now that we've, basically won against the Empire. Ha-ha. But the other thing, I mentioned it briefly earlier, this is something that engages me so much I decided to write my entire own book on the concept. It is the, now what? The Thrawn Trilogy is literally, the plot of the Thrawn Trilogy is literally, now what? Now, granted, that's how it starts, and then they take it somewhere. They tell another story in the Star Wars universe, just like all the extended universe things that are good do. But the reason I love that idea is it's something that's so very rarely explored properly in fiction. Return of the Jedi was definitively the end of that arc, really. It was a definitive, calculated, decisive victory. The good guys have won. The bad guys have lost. Now what? You see it? You get where I'm going with this? What happens after the curtain falls? What happens after the good guys have won? Maybe it's just me. I hope at least some of you agree with me on this idea, but the idea of the now what storyline is fascinating to me. There's so much you can do with something like that. And indeed, the Thrawn Trilogy does. It shows us a new galaxy, basically. How the galaxy turns and how the new governments have formed and all the new species. Again, the Bothans basically are the Bothans, thanks to the Thrawn Trilogy. All we knew about the Bothans in the movie was like one mention of them, and nobody had any idea what that meant. Fleshing out the Bothans and their role in the New Republic, and Borsk Felia, or however the hell he say his damn name, and just all of these new stories that all cropped up because of the now what. What happens then? What happens after the day is saved? Well, then you have to fix everything, right? And that's kind of the answer that Thrawn Trilogy gave. Now we got to fix the galaxy. And that actually continued all the way into the Hand of Thrawn duology. There's a reason that most people consider the Thrawn Trilogy to basically start the extended universe, and a lot of people consider the Hand of Thrawn duology to end the extended universe, because everything that happens between Return of the Jedi and the Hand of Thrawn duology, it's about a 23-year span, all ultimately fits within the same general category of story arc. It's all the next arc. And there's a lot of stories that happen in there, dozens upon dozens, but it's all about now what? Now we have to fix this. Now we have to deal with this. Now we have to deal with that. Now we have to prove that we're the New Republic. Now we have to show military force. Now we have to show diplomatic force. Now we have to deal with this. And all of that came full circle in the best way possible with the Empire, the Imperial Remnant, I believe actually, and the New Republic signing formal treaties. The perfect way to end that arc. The war formally, officially, no really, being ended finally. Then the Yuzon Vong showed up, which I'm not going to talk about. And then they did the legacy stuff, and just, whatever. Point being, All of that is because of that concept. Now what? And the obvious answer is, well, I mean, we keep going. Because life doesn't just end when the curtains fall. That's not how life is. But that's kind of my point. This helped flesh out Star Wars as a setting. That idea of now what? Because we analyzed it, because we went into it, because we discovered it. Rather than just sweeping it away and saying, okay, new story, we start developing what has already been established after the victory. Because that's what happens in real life, and that ties it together, that ties it to us, makes it more believable. Not realistic, but more believable. And therefore gives us more reason to care about it. You'll notice I don't even have notes here. I didn't really need them, to be honest with you. I had a few bullet points, which I just glanced at. But I've already covered all the things in my bullet points. But there's two things I want to discuss before I close this up. Like I said, it's probably going to be a short one. I have no idea how long it's been. I have a bad sense of time and I'm dizzy as hell. The first thing is Thrawn Naruto. Thrawn. Thrawn is a fascinating character in his own right. And it's no surprise that he is many people's most interesting or favorite or whatever character across Star Wars in general. The interesting thing about Thrawn is, for those of you who don't know, Timothy Zahn, actually, when he originally designed Thrawn, he realized he had kind of written himself into a corner because he'd made a villain that shouldn't lose. And so he kind of decided to write it so that Thrawn made more mistakes, was more flawed, was more human, if for lack of a more appropriate term. The irony is I think that works out really well. Thrawn does make quite a few mistakes. And it's interesting because he is actually quite human in his approach. He is, in many ways, what the ideal of the Imperial officer is, and yet at the same time he also has elements of the old Empire in him. While he will not, murder people on the front of his bridge because they screwed up a tractor beam situation, while he will not do Darth Vader's method, he will do a method of trying to inspire his troops. He will actually care about several of his troops, and he will show that. He will actually try to examine a situation and get the best outcome of it, and still caring about the outcome of that, still having enough diplomatic flair to him to show that he does actually give a damn about you, except it's arguable that he doesn't. It is debatable that Thrawn never actually cared about anyone, at least as far as his troops or whatnot goes, that they were all numbers and data bits to him, and his whole attempt at diplomacy and interacting with them was just another way of manipulating those data bits. He shows this a lot, actually. He does a lot of subtle things in his tactics, as far as expendability, I think is the best way to put that. And the way he shows that kind of highlights, I think, his perspective. And nothing does that more, I think, than the way he dealt with the Nogri. The Nogri, I've heard many different interpretations of what Vader, specifically Vader, intended for the Nogri. I've heard some people say that Vader always used them as a tool. I've heard some people say that Vader didn't want to use them as a tool, but accepted it because the Emperor ordered it. I've heard some people say that he was unaware of the fact they were being used as a tool. All this horrible stuff. But there's no denying that Thrawn sees them as nothing more than expendable tool, as nothing more than a currency to be utilized. And I don't think that's species bias. I think that's literally just the way he thinks. Let me explain a little bit. With all his troops, with all his people he works with, he has to play the game, so to speak, of diplomacy, of charisma, of leadership, of dealing with feelings and emotions and all those horrible, horrible things, right? He can't just be a computer around most people. But the Nogri have a near fanatical worship of him, and he knows that. He knows that they are sworn to follow him and that there's very little that could break that. Indeed, let's be honest, it was a long shot among long shots that Leia managed to break his hold over the Nogri. So he knows he doesn't have to deal with that crap with them. He doesn't have to put on a face. He doesn't have to put on a facade. He doesn't have to diplomatize. He can just be himself. You can tell a lot about a person and how they treat those they perceive as their lessers. I feel that that is the true Thrawn right there, that he is a ruthless, computer-like, cold calculus individual who is really only interested in the results. Now, granted, we do find out later he had a reason for thinking like that. But even when you read some of the old stuff, the stuff that happened during the Old Republic era involving Thrawn and whatnot, he still shows aspects of that personality. And I'm pretty sure Zahn did that on purpose, specifically so that Thrawn could be not only a multi-dimensional, faceted character, but so he is still definitively a villain. Whereas, by contrast, if Pelayan, as he is written, was the bad guy, he would be much more sympathetic. He would be much less evil. We would actually feel for him when he dies at the hands of the Noghri. I don't actually think Pelayan would have done that thing with the Noghri, to be blunt. He might have considered it, and he might have accepted it, but at no time would he have taken Thrawn's, oh, thank God, I have an expendable resource, I don't have to pretend around attitude on it. Now, again, all of this is my interpretation, because that's a book. That's how this works. But it's also interesting because Thrawn had a layer to him. Layers, I should say. Layers to him. The way he acted, the way he functioned around people. The fact that he was willing to change how he acted around different people is crucial because it gives us bits and pieces of Thrawn that we can interpret. I mentioned earlier, we never jump into Thrawn's head. Almost all the Imperial scenes, or almost all the scenes, I should say, where we interact with Thrawn, we either have the perspective of Mara Jade, occasionally, or Pelayan. Those are the perspectives we have. That's it. Nothing else. And so it's done deliberately so that we have shadings to him that deliberately paint an incomplete picture, so that no matter what, we have to interpret Thrawn. We can't actually say, oh, well, this is what he was thinking, or this is how he was actually feeling. All we can do is deliberate on that, which is one of the other beautiful things you can do in a book, is show different perspectives of the same character and the different thoughts on the same character that are not that character. I would love to hear your guys' interpretations of Thrawn, Talon-Karrde, Mara Jade, Bella Bliss, Winters, go for it. I'm loving it. Which brings me to that last point I wanted to talk about. Because of the unique nature of a book and everything I talked about with regards to interpretation, I'd love to hear your guys' interpretation. I may not respond to every comment I get, but let me make this clear. I actually have it set up so I get every notification, and I read every comment I get, and I love reading everyone's different ideas and interpretations. I read all of those answers to the question I posed in A New Hope with regards to Obi-Wan's sacrifice, and I read some fascinating stuff there, and that was interesting. I read a lot of people's responses for the video that just went live yesterday. They give me away the timeline there, of Empire Strikes Back, and so forth and so on. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts and interpretations, but I also want to open the door on something. Nowadays, I don't actually do Q&A videos. The reason why is because, for those of you who were not around during that time, the Q&A videos were basically killing me. They were taking up so much of my time that I literally had no time to devote to anything else. Not just for the show, but like for my own hobbies and enjoyments and whatnot. 100% of my free time was reading the questions, writing down my answers to them, and then recording it, and then notating it, and giving the timestamps and all that. It was so... And each time I'd finish one, I'd have more questions. So I stopped that and started doing that on the stream. So for anybody who ever wants to do a Q&A with me, just hit me up on the stream. I will answer questions all over the place, and I do it every time I stream, even if I'm doing a lore run. You've probably seen this. But for this one example, if you want to ask things about the Thrawn Trilogy or the characters in the Thrawn Trilogy, if you want to hit me up with Q&A about this topic, go for it. The gate has been flung open, and I'm listening. I'm listening. No one's going to get that. Anyways, I got to get off here. I'm going to go lay down. I feel terrible. Have a good one, guys. Happy New Year.